rate merchant,
Yeah.
and he equates heart rate with kind of the level of suffering needed to succeed.
Uh-huh.
And we're going through a little bit of a psychological journey
Good.
to help him understand that heart rate isn't the end all and be all for success. So he comes out of a season this year, which is all about zone seven, if there's such a thing. I mean, he's been flying so close to the sun. I'm surprised he did not end up in the emergency room with so much heart rate work that he did during training and during races. So this is
Wow.
super helpful.
Great. Yeah. Well, if it was just about heart rate training, we certainly wouldn't be spending lots of money on and time on power meters
No,
or GPS and pace. But it's amazing. You pull them all together. They all have value. When and how you pull these, as coaches, is what's going to make you guys, successful. So, yeah, tonight's topic will really help for you then for sure. Okay.
okay.
I share my screen. Give you my desktop. All right. So we should be able to see everything that I've got going on here. Is that the case?
Yeah, hey Cliff, was that Megan? Somebody just texted. Is she area code 310?
That might be the case. Let's see.
Yeah.
Megan. She says aloha from Kona. Very nice. Very timely, Megan. Okay. I don't think maybe she's joining us though. All right. So let's get started. And just let me know if you can't see anything that I'm sharing with you, okay? So make sure that we are also recording, which looks good. Okay. Okay, guys, so let's kick it off. All right, so why do we train by heart rate? Heart rate is simply one energy system, and it's a measurement of output, right? Just like other things that we are tracking directly in our training, heart rate tells us how the body is responding to stress and to load. Heart rate can be used to set the upper end of our training limits and to force us to go harder when it's needed, and oftentimes it's a regulator to make sure that we don't go too hard. But heart rate really tells us much more about the aerobic energy system, and that's why we're more interested in it and how it is performing. So we look at heart rate oftentimes to give us kind of like an overall sense of where we are in well-being and how we're performing. So it's not as absolute as a measurement tool, but it's a really critical one to understanding how our own bodies are performing. So it's more specific to the individual. So when you pair heart rate with pace and perceived effort, now we have the full story of performance and how things are being understood. We really are only looking through a sliver of what's happening when we only have, for instance, power, when we only have pace. But when we put heart rate and we have the whole picture, we can say, well, this is clearly what happened. So oftentimes our athletes won't give us every single data piece, but it is really a great window within when we have heart rate. So we don't always pace with it. We don't always use it for every single circumstance, but it is a really critical thing to understand. So it allows us to check out our athletes' needs from their training plans. For instance, we can tell if they need more power work, more pace work, or perhaps they need more heart rate work. And it tells us more or less training stress in total. So heart rate can help to also dial in nutrition. This is something that's kind of a little bit less misunderstood and is somewhat of a more advanced topic that we'll get into in future and subsequent calls, but it is an important piece. For instance, when we spend more time training subsequently in heart rate zone 2, we're teaching our body to burn fat as a fuel source and rather than carbohydrate energy. So it's a critical thing to be monitoring for your athletes. So we've got a couple definitions we have to kind of run through here. One in particular is threshold heart rate, or LTHR, lactate threshold heart rate. So this is the final 20-minute average heart rate from an FTP test on a bike or run. And in swimming, we rarely use lactate threshold heart rate as it's hard to measure and tends to be a bit lower than prescribed effort. So we don't really, as coaches, give prescribed efforts in swimming at heart rate because it's pretty difficult to look and see what your heart rate is when you're swimming. So we use a lot of subjective perceived effort type of stuff. So the test, we've gone through some of the testing in some of the earlier modules that we've had in terms of how to calculate, how to do your FTP tests. But essentially it's that final 20-minute average of a very hard effort in running and biking, where we know we started and finished and we gave it everything we had. And so that becomes the basis and the starting point for all of our zones. Now, LTHR, you're going to hear a lot of different terms that get thrown around at you. But LTHR may be measured by blood lactate testing, or LT we call it, or gas exchange metabolic cart testing. As a lot of you guys know, I used to do a lot of that testing. Or as what you'll see as ANT, and ANT and LTHR, all the same thing, guys. Really just a little bit different in terms of how they're measured. So whether it's gas exchange or it's blood testing, these are all very more scientific ways of arriving at the same thing. I find nowadays that it's really not necessary to do as much physiological testing as some coaches might highly recommend. Field testing is really important and can be a great way to measure all of this stuff. So does it mean that you never test your athletes in a laboratory setting? No. Does it mean that it's not a nice to know? Yeah, it's nice to know. But really, ultimately, it comes down to the interpretation of the data and the analysis of the coach. So if the coach can really surmise based on an athlete's ability, they can basically not have to do quite as much testing. So that's a helpful thing to understand. The LTHR should be input into Training Peaks to calculate your athlete's training heart rate zones. So we know how to do that. We know how to go in and auto-calculate their zones based on their threshold heart rate. Now get into the nitty and the gritty a bit. Beginner athletes, or our A-level athletes, so really our newbies, our first-year athletes, maybe even first, second, and third-year athletes, depending on their ability, will have higher absolute lactate threshold heart rates. After 1 to 2 years approximately of endurance training, this will likely go down. They will need to be consistent at their training to see it come down. It most certainly goes down when they're consistently training for an Ironman, for instance. So we see that there's an adjustment factor in that first year or two for those types of athletes. Your intermediate athletes, or your B-level athletes, will have more stable lactate threshold heart rates and zones with more consistent training, and they need not be as adjusted as often or if at all. Instead, what you're going to see dramatically is that their paces improve with particular heart rates. So their FTPs need regular testing and monitoring, but you're going to find that you can start to give them a bit more pace, power, and perceived effort work as they establish their aerobic base. Our more advanced athletes, so we're talking about the elites and professionals, they're going to need minimal heart rate based training specific through their training cycles and loads, and rather they have to be more focused on FTP, functional threshold power, pace, and rate of perceived effort. So I'll pause there for a second and see what, if any, questions you guys have so far. Anybody out there?
I just have something I think we discussed in the previous session, and I think you may have mentioned at the time, Cliff, that for advanced athletes, the heart rate zones are pretty static in a good way. In other words, they don't fluctuate over the years, but they're fairly set. So am I reading that basically means the LTHR is pretty much the same? So it's not so much what the actual number is, but what happens at that level of heart rate in terms of output.
Correct. Yeah, and so I'll use myself as an example here. Many years ago, when I was training for Ironman Florida, and I was questing after a specific time goal, and I did a benchmarking test about a year and change out, and I went on a treadmill and ran, and at what I knew was my Ironman heart rate of about 150 beats per minute at that time, and I was running around a 9.5, 10-minute mile, and I did it for 30 minutes. And when I checked back in about a year later, after lots of training, threshold work, strength work, endurance work, um, I was able to run about 20 to 23 miles. I did it 3 times at that same heart rate, and the pace was about a 650 to a 655 minute mile. So, right, the heart rate was identical, and I was able to sustain it for much, much longer at a much, much faster pace. So, yeah, and that happens, you know, that shows you the transition from somebody I was very detrained when I started and very trained at the end of it. So to see that, spectrum is pretty dramatic. Your athletes, you will see much more variability in their pace and output, and far less variability in their heart rate.
Mm-hmm.
Does that help you, Attila? I think I answered it.
Yeah, very much so.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any physiological signs that the athlete can pay attention to in the absence of any proper testing? That I know we talk about effort and the actual output, but anything in relation to RPEs or what happens to breathing, anything that could be self-observed by the athlete?
In terms of heart rate work specific? Yeah, we're going to touch base on a couple of things. One is actually heart rate variability and resting heart rate. Those two are probably the biggest that it doesn't matter if you're a professional or beginner, you're going to be monitoring. So I would say those would be the other ones. So yeah. So I'll continue on here and jump into threshold heart rate continued. Our level A athletes, after periods of inactivity or they're detrained, they're going to need longer to rebuild, their aerobic base. It's going to erode more quickly. Somebody who has had more extensive years of training, they're going to get back to that physiological goodness much more regularly. So I've written here in the notes that it may take base periods for our level A athletes, beginners, to be 8 to 15 weeks of base periods. And base can be kind of a loose term, doesn't mean that you do just zone 2 work, but it's going to have quite a bit of zone 2 and zone 3 as the base. And you guys know, I've told you in the past that about 90%, 85 to 90% is going to be that zone 2, zone 3 type of work for our extensive endurance athletes. So unless they're training for like a criterium or something that lasts 30 minutes to 60 minutes, that base work is pretty critical. Our level B athletes, after periods of inactivity or when they're detrained, they're going to need more like 6 to 12 weeks of base building and heart rate specific type of work. Our level C athletes, they're on the range of more like 2 to 6 weeks after inactivity. So this is good for when you're applying to your athletes, if they've been sick or they, have taken some time down in the off season. You're going to be looking at this when you're rebuilding them a bit. So during build phases, our level A athletes are mostly heart rate focused. Our level B have a mix of heart rate and pace and power and speed work and more course specificity. Our level C athletes are pretty exclusive to FTP, RPE, and the course specifics when they get into those final build phases. Peak racing, you're going to see your level A athletes have a mix of heart rate, FTP, and RPE. Your level B athletes are more focused on their longer sessions of heart rate. That's where heart rate's going to live, on the longer sessions, that is. And their midweek sessions are going to be more shorter perceived effort and FTP based. Your level C athletes really at peak are going to be all in at FTP and RPE for the most part. I know I'm throwing these terms around pretty quickly here, but you do have these to look back and reference, okay? So AET, another term that gets thrown into the coaching jargon. Probably as athletes you wouldn't be as familiar with these concepts, but these are less used even in day-to-day coaching jargon, but they really are important because you're going to come across them in your coaching, and for your own edification, you need to know these. So this is synonymous, AET, with a relatively low level of intensity. It's marked by light breathing and the feeling that you could really maintain this for quite some hours. And for definition, it occurs at about 60% of your aerobic capacity, or 70% of your max heart rate, and around 80% of your lactate threshold. A ballpark way of determining your aerobic threshold is generally to subtract 30 beats per minute from your lactate threshold heart rate. So you can go ahead and do these calculations at your own thresholds to kind of see where these live. I find that this calculation for me is a little bit off. It actually makes the number quite low, so you kind of have to do a little bit of self-calibration, but it gets you a good idea for where this number lives. So in a testing lab, aerobic threshold is usually defined as the intensity at which lactate just begins to accumulate above resting level. So again, AET, pretty low level of output. So for our A-level athletes, this is going to occur generally at a walking pace. I can tell you that when I would test our athletes at the TriStar Labs, I would find that, people who are just newbies, or people who are new to endurance training, it's very easy for them to go right into pretty hard effort, and that's not uncommon. So you should just be aware of that. And that's why a lot of training plans early on need to incorporate, this very tepid pace, low heart rate, walk-run type of thing. So this is a very trainable value, and we can improve AET pretty readily by training in zones 2 and 3. Our advanced athletes, they can actually train their AET right up to their LTHR. So I'll say that again. The AET, they can do so much training, so much aerobic work, so much endurance work that they can get it right up to their threshold, which is pretty phenomenal, and it means that they're very efficient. So this is what you as coaches can unlock and uncork for people. When they're applying the training plans and through consistent work and monitoring, and it may take some years, quite some years, but they can get themselves to such a high level of fitness that their economy is so good that they're getting right up to their threshold, and that the beats per minute from aerobic, how aerobic they are, to their threshold is going to be very few. So how can this be measured? It can be confirmed with metabolic cart testing. As I mentioned, it's a nice to know, but it's not as critical for your athletes. When I would test our athletes at the TriStar Studios and labs, I basically would calculate their aerobic baseline. That's similar to where an athlete would race an Ironman, and we call it your aerobic base because that's where 50% of your fuel source is coming from fat and 50% is coming from carbohydrate. And so that's a nice line that we use. It's also pretty synonymous with the top of your zone 2 in terms of heart rate, but as I just mentioned, that value could be all the way up to somebody's threshold if they're doing a lot of endurance work. This concept is not all that applicable to somebody who's doing, their first sprint, or maybe even they may not be all that necessary for people who are doing like hard bike rides that are 60 minutes long, criteriums and things like that. But the longer the endurance, the more important these concepts become. So, factors that influence heart rate, there are so many. I listed just a few. Heat, stress, life stress, dehydration, food, age, gender, caffeine, just to name some. And so it is for this very reason why heart rate alone is not an objective enough tool to use for most athletes, especially our intermediate to advanced, but it is really important because it just tells us overall how this person is performing. So if you want to be the doctor and the detective, you're going to need to know how heart rate is an interplay for your athletes. Again, you may not be delivering as much in terms of their pacing and their output, but you need to know what their heart is telling you. Resting heart rate is a key marker, Attila, as you kind of alluded to and you were asking about for your athlete, as a marker for seeing training improvement, as well as knowing when to take a rest day. Heart rate variability, or is HRV, is small variations between the heart rate beats, which can tell us how the body is responding to and coping with training and life stressors. There are ways to measure this through watches, devices, and HRV is a metric that is pulled into Training Peaks. In my personal experience, I don't use it as much because I tend to find that the self-monitored athlete has to be very in tune with this information and use it on a regular basis. So some athletes get into it and some like it. I don't see it being as applicable to more new athletes. So your beginners, intermediates, they'll use it and they'll like it. If you have a more quote unquote geeky type of athlete, it's cool and it is definitely helpful. If you're balancing their training plan correctly, HRV is less interesting. But if they have a lot of moving parts, like they're not sleeping well, or they have a lot of life stress, or other things that can be compounding their training, then HRV becomes interesting, and it may help them to take a rest day when they need it. So some folks will expect their daily HRV to directly reflect the previous day's training, but it really doesn't. For the most part, it's it's more indicative of the overall health of the athlete over multiple days, weeks, months, and even that life cycle of the continuous training load or the CTL. So it's usually other factors and intensity really in training that we look to use HRV for. So other HRV factors, recovery from the previous day's training may already be complete by the following morning. Training at lower intensities such as zone 1 and zone 2 actually produces very little stress, and when it performed at very high volumes, like if you go and see an athlete do like a huge day on the bike, let's say 8 hours, or they do a big long run, you're not necessarily going to see heart rate variability. You will see heart rate variability if they go and do, for instance, very high threshold work. The next day, their body may be very stressed and will show signs of a dip in their heart rate variability. So lifestyle stressors such as sleep quality, as I mentioned, nutrition, mental and emotional stresses have an important influence on total stress load that the body is experiencing. High life loads, we could put on a TSS that's LTSS for life TSS. I mean, there's lots of different ones we can track here, even though we track generally mostly just training ones. That's a whole separate topic of how there are limitations to the training stress models that we use for coaching, but we know that for the most part we have pretty good ones when it comes to the actual training themselves. So as I mentioned, this is actually an example of heart rate variability, and this is an athlete that we pull their information and see that here their actual resting heart rate is rising, and then they have functional heart rate values. Heart rate variability is actually quite good from about the 2nd here to the 15th of January. And then all of a sudden they have this big drop off and an increase in their resting heart rate. And this is telling us that, they are in the red zone. So Attila, if your athlete was finding, a law of diminishing returns or couldn't figure out why they were constantly getting sick, this would be a good example where they were in this, non-functional state of training, and heart rate variability would have keyed that off quite early. So there's an example of where you could do that. I'll pause there. Any questions? I'm sure we got a couple on the burner. Okay.
Well, Cliff, I had asked you about that product, which off the top of my head, I forget what it is. A Massimo something or other that you could test you could get this readout every morning. Mm-hmm. Is there a value added for that product for an average, athlete?
I would say this, yes and no. It's one more thing that you need to be tracking and charting. There are quite a few products out there that do this type of thing. And I remember when they first became available, and I got pretty excited about it because I thought, wow, wouldn't it be amazing for our athletes to be able to remotely monitor them and say, hey, you should take a rest day when you see this value. And the reality is when you give the proper training plan, you don't see a whole lot of variability. You don't see people needing to take multiple rest days. Like if you had somebody that was doing a lot of heart rate work, like really hard threshold work, then it would be more interesting. But that type of stress, we already know that that's only going to represent like 10% of an athlete's weekly protocol at some point. And so the chances of them really getting into a fatigue state, the plans give them a rest day. The next day, we're not saying go do 3 hours worth of more heart rate work. That's poor planning. So all of the plans that you guys are starting with have inherently built into them spacing to provide, adequate recovery. If your athletes start stacking things and they have a knack for moving their schedules around, Suzanne, you may find that they would benefit from something like that.
Okay.
Yeah. I think it is a really interesting area that is still evolving, and even Training Peaks I think could do a better job of displaying that type of a thing. Like I envision, more of a trigger that just says, hey, it'll probably come from Garmin, frankly. Garmin will probably say, hey, we've noticed, over the last 4 or 5 days, a resting heart rate variability problem, and it presupposes that you wear the Garmin every day, and we know that you have to take it off and charge it. So there's some known issues, mostly lifestyle related at this point, as to why they're not the reason why you see them as often.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Great question. All right. So other considerations with heart rate based training that you have to consider: you have to be very careful with your athletes forcing heart rate over RPE and or pace. I'm going to try to be careful to be diplomatic about this. There's another coaching organization that really likes heart rate, and they like to make it ultra simple, and they give one zone and then they give another zone. So there's really 2 zones, and in that particular coaching organization, you are really designing a plan that is solely based on heart rate, and so it forces you into hard or easy. And when you push the heart, at times it may not be ready for it. You're actually forcing, when somebody's very fit, to push their heart may be a very bad thing. They're gonna train way too hard, or sometimes way too easy, and so it becomes this very inappropriate measure. And so fundamentally, when you force heart rate over perceived effort and pace, bad things are going to happen. So a lot of times in our plans at TriStar, I try to give a lot of perceived effort ceilings, maximums. So it's inherent that a C-level athlete, right, if you give them even a modest higher heart rate, they'll be at threshold or higher by FTP standards. Suzanne, you're a great example of this. Oftentimes I have to completely tell her to forget about heart rate, because if she went and tried to push her heart, she would break her body down. She would really have a problem. Kyle, you're a similar example where you have to be really cautious with heart rate to not nuke you. So really important for you guys to understand that your athletes are going to do exactly what you tell them, and that's a very powerful and wonderful thing, and that it's also a responsibility to make sure that they are cared for. So no athlete has ever raced an Ironman above a heart rate of 160 as an average. At least none of our coaches have seen it, and that's myself, Adam, and anybody else. I've not seen the data, so if you have it out there, let me know, pro or not. As an absolute number, because normally we're talking about zones and things like this, I'm just letting you know, when you see your athletes and they're running at a heart rate of 160, or they're biking at a heart rate of 160, and they tell you it feels easy, physiologically, internally, it is not easy. It is not easy, unless they're under the age of 15 or 16, where all kids have very high heart rates, and that's normal. So just put that in the back of your mind, file it away, so you understand that that's kind of a crazy big number for an Ironman. I remember seeing TJ Tollickson's numbers for the first time in Kona, and they had this live distribution of pro heart rates and powers, and I was stunned watching him ride along the Queen K at a heart rate of like 160, 165. And in my head, I said, this does not make any sense. Sure enough, walking on the run, totally blew up. Now, maybe he was doing it on purpose because he had to, ride hard to show face and whatnot. But anyway, suffice to say, that is a good thing for you guys to be aware of. Heart rate in racing can be about plus 5 to 8 beats per minute higher easily on the day with temperature or athlete motivation, nerves, and freshness. So just remember, telling your athletes on race day if they're a little bit higher out of the gate, they can support it on the day if they're fitter. So if they're not that fit and they're your beginner athletes, you want to recommend that they try to stick to the heart rate that you've given them. But on race day, they can support a little bit more. Most folks can. So while we like to compare zones side by side, and I mean zones meaning power zones, heart rate zones, pace zones, they are unique. They're measuring different energy systems. So just bear in mind that I've given you a chart here on this link to go ahead and reference, but they are going to get out of whack based on all these things that I'm telling you. And your athletes will say, well, if I'm in zone 2 heart rate, shouldn't I be in power zone 2? The answer is no, never. They may at times sync up, and that's nice and convenient, but that's really not the way it works, okay? So I will pause there and hopefully stop sharing my screen so I can see you guys. And it's a lot darker over here now. So what do you guys think? Questions? Comments? Did you take it all to heart?
I guess I have a question.
Yeah.
You would tell me early on, especially when it was like a more intense workout, that looking at if there was like a power goal and also a heart rate goal,
Mm-hmm.
to really go by feel and like focus on power, if anything, but like the heart rate, it takes a while to kind of come up to that level, and it's also a little bit unreliable. The only place now that I find myself actually paying attention to heart rate is if you have me with a longer, easier ride that's supposed to kind of maybe go into zone 2, but barely.
Mm-hmm.
If you're ever looking at heart rate, running or biking, is that the place, or is there another place? Because I'm only looking at it as a measure of, I guess, not fitness, but recovery, like how rested I am.
Yeah, so there's a couple other things that we haven't talked about in the context of this heart rate discussion, which is things like efficiency factor. And so you're not looking to see what zone you're actually in or anything like that, but you're trying to see, for the power I'm putting out, do I have less beats per minute, right? So those things are very valuable, and you can track directly your progress if you're looking at, let's say a session from 4 weeks ago to today, and if it was done in the same way, right, we would expect some sort of output difference besides, hey, I put the same wattage down. And so if that's the case, you look at efficiency factor, and that tells you a lot of things. Heart rate can be variable from one day to the next. So that's why we have to be careful with looking at heart rate like that. I do think there's a time and a place to focus on heart rate, even if you are an elite athlete. For instance, if you want to make sure that you're trying to hit VO2, sometimes to bring the body into shape, we kind of want to pump up the heart a little bit, but that has to be really done carefully, and you want to make sure that your athletes are rested, because oftentimes your athletes are training on fatigue, and when they're training on fatigue, that means that they're really not able to express the heart rate that they would be when they're rested, and we see that more so on race day. So yeah, I think I answered the question there.
Yep.
Did I?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. All right, good. Attila, I see the gears turning. What do you think? Any questions from you on all this subject?
No, as you were talking about when the athlete says, hold on a minute, doing 170 beats per minute felt easy. That was literally what I got in the notes today in Training Peaks from my athlete. And I jokingly told him that, don't worry, we'll get to suffer zone, but we'll do so responsibly. So just keep breathing, and we'll get there, but we're not in that phase of training just yet.
Yeah, you may want to pose it back to him and say, if you're at a heart rate of 170, where do you go from there? 180, 190?
He camped out in 180 this season,
Mm-hmm.
and not so jokingly, I told him that he's going to make quite a few cardiologists very rich very soon, and there's it's just not the right way of going about it.
Right. You may want to phrase it to him like this: there's only so many times your heart can beat in a week. You
Yes.
know, and I could ask you to stand there all day long and curl with with your bicep a pound or 5 pounds or whatever. Only so many times you can do this stuff, and so you have to prepare the body for what you're looking for and what you want it to do. And if you want it to redline at 180 for that long, then you actually would want to do that type of training. One example of that actually where we see it a lot more for cyclists. So you have very high output on cycling or 5Ks. If an athlete went into that type of a race and they had never seen some of those heart rates, it might be difficult for them to sustain it. And so that's where actually heart rate training does become a little more interesting. But because of the fact that when you are very fit, heart rate it keeps moving into the ethos. It's behind you as a value to track.
There was it's actually I think this year or maybe last year a interesting book called The Haywire Heart.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you guys came across that book.
You told me about it, Attila.
Yeah, right. So that's just really for extreme conditions, because I'm actually thinking about getting my athlete this book just to get him off the high heart rate horse and take it really seriously, because he's a wonderfully passionate, enthusiastic young gentleman in his 20s, and I think he needs a lot of guidance. That he just needs to slow down heart rate wise.
Yeah, well, he's training harder, not necessarily smarter, but that's why he has you. So, yeah,
Right.
Yeah, no, that's good. Suzanne, any questions over there?
No, it's just, because I am at the opposite extreme, this is all kind of foreign to me.
Yeah, I can.
What's the highest threshold heart rate you've ever seen? You're going to say some number, and I'm going to be like, oh my God.
Yeah, so this is really important for you to learn, because
Right.
a lot of the people you'll be working with will have this as a limiter. 230 is kind of like the biggest number I've ever seen as an absolute number, and anything above, frankly, 190, I'm stunned by. My own personal maximum, when I was in my 20s, I could sustain, I remember 184 for like 2 minutes, and I don't think I've seen a number above 170 in 4 years. So, everybody, it's kind of like shoe size, it's big or small. I mean, it's unique to the individual. Taller athletes are going to have lower maximums. Shorter athletes are going to have higher maximums. You've got some with butterfly heart rates. You've got some with, these big thuds. So that's why, again, heart rate is unique to the individual. It's extremely fascinating to look at. And I actually get really excited when I see that type of information, even on athletes I don't know, because then it starts to tell me a lot about that athlete. So, for instance, if your athlete really likes to redline their heart rate a lot, you're going to find they probably aren't as lean. Metabolically speaking, they have some room to aerobically lean out and get more efficient. So they're running that body hot. It's a carbohydrate hot engine, and they may have sweets cravings, and they may have other kind of interesting things that are more challenging to their training. But I like looking at heart rate because it tells me directionally where to help people go. Yeah.
At some point, are you going to talk about decoupling? Because again, another thing that not a part of my life.
Yeah, I'll touch on it a little bit here, because we're going to spend more time on it on advanced analysis for races. That's another subject. But decoupling, what Suzanne mainly is asking about is, right, as power or pace is being held, at what point and how much is the heart rate, and what is the relationship that it's moving directionally to that power or pace? So if we say that you're decoupling, that means your heart rate's going up as your power is subsequently going down, or pace is going down. And so we know that more than about 6% of decoupling of those two values is going to be mean you don't have the ability to sustain that output for very long. And the more that variability exists, or the more that decoupling exists, the more we need more endurance training at that prescribed heart rate, for instance. So the ranges of that, I'm actually going to text that to you now. I think you may have this, but I'll just send it to you now. And so I just sent you, that's a whole list of all the ranges of the decoupling that actually happens, and some ways to think about what to do with your athletes and how to interpret it. All decoupling is not bad. You actually need some decoupling to achieve new things. You need to place a load on a body. But we look at decoupling more for steady state stuff. Good? Check the box on that one? Okay, good.
The only quick thing I want to share